It's a fantastic industry to work in. I think it's on the edge of transformation. I think there is a clear regulatory system in place now for some of the problems that we've had in the last 5 to 10 years. I think digitalization is beginning to mature to the point where some great things will come of it in the next 5 to 10 years.
Today we're joined by Alan Muse, a highly respected figure in the construction and cost management world. Alan has spent over 40 years working across the industry as a consultant, director and advisor on some of the UK's largest and most complex construction projects. He's worked across a number of sectors, from commercial developments all the way through to infrastructure projects and public sector programme. He's also played a leading role at the RICS as a global director of the built environment, where he shaped many of the key standards that underpin modern cost management and project delivery today. Great. So Alan, we'll jump straight in then. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Really look forward to this conversation.
No, thank you for having me.
No worries. So we'll dive straight in. So Alan, you've, as I kind of mentioned in your introduction there, you've been deeply involved in sort of developing and promoting industry standards, across construction, for the duration of your career. But now in today's day and age, why would you say that standards matter more now than they did 10 or 20 years ago?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think one issue there is the complexity of the construction industry. I think the industry has grown in complexity, both in technical terms and organisational terms. And I think those two factors have meant that standardisation to improve efficiency and productivity in the industry are more required now than ever, but particularly in terms of the increases in complexity that we've seen in terms of the organisational structure of the industry over the last 10 to 20 years. I think another issue is regulation. I mean, following issues, unfortunate issues like the Grenfell Tower fire, regulation in terms of building, fire safety, etc., has been much improved, and the dicing and slicing of the process now means that regulations are much more required than they were in the past. Another issue is clients, in fact, requiring more evidence that the process has been adhered to, and therefore standards are more relevant in that regard. And I think generally there's a feeling in the industry that it needs to become more transparent and accountable. And obviously standards allow that transparency and accountability to show through in each of those processes. I think another factor is insurance. I think insurance of the industry, where that's required, has become more focused on that accountability and being able to evidence that the things that are supposed to have happened have actually happened in the process. I think two other large factors which I've kept to the end are the digital transformation in the industry, which we've seen since the uptake of BIM in the late and the BIM mandate in 2015, 2016, leading of course now to AI, artificial intelligence and digital twins. Digital transformation requires standardisation of data, because certainly AI needs the data, but it needs the data in a refined sense in order for it to make sense of the AI agents that are in use. So I think the digital transformation of the industry has led to a greater importance of standards, and last but certainly not least, the whole issue of sustainability and carbon economics has meant that we need to be able to measure carbon in the both in an embodied sense and also in a whole life cycle sense, and therefore standards in this area are probably the new beginnings of a whole new profession in the industry looking at carbon economics. And so for all those reasons, I think standards are much more required now than they were even 20 years ago.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, great. That's a really good breakdown from a few different angles. And of course, across compliance, insurance, and sustainability, these are all really important sort of areas that construction companies need to focus on. But as you know, their main aims, or some of their main aims alongside those, will be how they increase productivity, trust within teams, and most importantly, just create better project outcomes, both for the contractors and the clients and everyone involved in the supply chain. So, what would you say good standards actually unlock for the industry in terms of productivity and better project outcomes?
Well, yes, I mean, standards are only as good as the value they add to the industry, and for the reasons I've said, I think there is a need for more standards. But I think what they give is they give things that the industry desperately needs, like predictability. I mean, predictability in terms of what it will cost, the duration of this project, what the quality outcomes are for the construction of the particular thing that the asset that you're looking to produce. All this predictability is very important for the industry because it affects investment in the industry, and therefore predictability is, I would say, quite an important issue in terms of standards. Also, interoperability. I mean, I think I talked about the digital transformation, but I think in order to be able to look at the whole project life cycle, and in order to be able to look across professions and connect professions in an interdisciplinary way, standards allow that interoperability that otherwise the industry struggles with because it's so fragmented. Also related to that is scalability. The industry has moved on from small local projects to projects and programs and portfolios of work that can be carried out across the country, quite often in cases such as schools and hospitals, for example. And that scalability, it can be improved enormously by the use of standards and a standard way of doing things. I think also somewhat controversially, standards can add to innovation because they can give stable baselines for work which allow innovation to occur in construction. So as long as you know you're doing everything properly and accountable and in a transparent way, it allows more room for innovation in the industry. I think also I was always taught that the key issue in terms of team building in the industry is trust between the various professions and the individuals that work in construction. And standards do improve that trust, because if you know that your fellow professional is going to provide the right information in the right form at the right time because of standard X, then that trust is improved in terms of how you work together. I think the whole life issue that I've already touched upon is also quite important, because I think as an economy, as we try to get more for less, particularly in the public sector, we are looking at capital cost versus running costs and maintenance costs in a much more detailed way. And in order for that to work properly, we need standards that work across the whole project life cycle, both in terms of looking at cost, but also, as I said before, carbon. So I think standards can provide a lot of benefits to the industry, and I think it's important that the industry sees them as a value-adding tool rather than bureaucracy.
Yeah, no, some really good points there. And yeah, I think across the industry, we do see a lot of companies talk about how they're following standards, and they post their different sort of certification badges on the website, and talk about the culture of standards and health and safety practices. But what we sometimes find out is that these standards are not being applied properly. So the intention is there, but the execution is not. Can you kind of comment on why you think that is, and why sometimes it doesn't work as planned?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And anybody who's been involved with standards has been frustrated sometimes by the intent, but not, the intent is there, but not the application or the execution. I think the first point I'd like to make is that it's not about documents; it's about behaviours. Documents um, standards are invariably written in a document form, but they are about the culture and behaviour of the whole organisation and how people in that organisation are incentivised to perform. So it's not just about ticking the boxes; it's about doing the whole work culture right first in first time, because that's a more efficient process, and standards help that to be achieved. And I think sometimes if people were incentivised in organisations in slightly different ways, that would take effect more. So I think it's linked to behaviours and the work culture as well. I think there are obviously commercial pressures in construction. Construction is a time-pressured industry and also a cost-pressured industry, and those commercial pressures can lead to people thinking that standards are more bureaucracy than they are helpful. But as I say, that's related to the culture in the workplace and how leaders actually encourage their teams to adhere to standards. I think coming on to that leadership issue is quite important as well, because there are leadership contradictions here. I mean, on the one hand, leadership wants the job done well, and it wants to certify and account that it's been done well, but on the other hand, it wants it done quickly and it wants it done to certain cost pressures. So you've got to sort out those leadership contradictions in an organisation and assess that standards are actually a central part of your organisational culture, because we want the work done right first time. I think also the fragmentation in the industry doesn't help the case for that. We have got complicated supply chains, and that fragmentation is something that you need to embody by perhaps having, as I said before, a more interdisciplinary and collaborative approach to construction. So I think one of the problems is, going back to this value issue in leadership, is standards need to be seen as adding value, and sometimes they're not seen as adding value. They're seen as as a hurdle to jump. But they can add value if they're used in the right way and the culture is right. And the final thing I'd like to say is that I think the industry is increasingly becoming focused on audit and enforcement, as I said before, about tighter and stricter regulation. And I think you make your life a lot easier if you have standards that are being followed in terms of that audit and enforcement procedure. And I think that helps everybody and gives the organisation the confidence to proceed in a way that can get the job finished, but feel confident that the audit and procedures are being followed properly because we've followed the standards.
Yeah, no, some really good points on how leadership and culture actually really contribute to standards obviously translating into actual execution. So yeah, there's definitely a gap there that still exists in construction. So if we kind of take a step back and really obviously look at your career and the fact that you've worked across different countries and markets. Now, of recent, a lot of our talent here in the UK has been exported to other markets. And maybe you can touch on some of the reasons for that. But obviously, working across some of these different countries that you've worked in the past, how does the UK construction industry actually compare? And that's across a number of fronts. Maybe when it comes to actual standards of work, when it comes to the complexity of projects. Yeah, how do you actually see the UK comparing with other markets?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, by the way, a question that we don't think about enough in the UK generally in terms of comparison and international best practice, if you like. I think it's a very difficult question to answer in the binary, obviously, because I think we are good at some things and bad at others. I think in terms of comparison about efficiency and productivity, which is always one problem in the UK and is a well-known problem in terms of UK construction, that Japan, Sweden, South Korea and others do much better. But they have a culture of more collaboration. They have a culture of more off-site and industrialised construction. So those are areas where perhaps we're not as good. But on the other hand, we have some superb professional skills in construction. Our architects are world renowned. I would like to think that quantity surveying, started in the UK and leads the world in terms of some of the standards that the RICS and others have produced in that area. And also engineers, civil engineers and structural engineers are well known and well used in the global market, British structural engineers and civil engineers. So we have some positives. I think one that is neither a positive or a negative is the legal side, because we have a common law jurisdiction, which means that we always have to we have a tendency to want to prove things in court rather than using civil law, which can lead to an adversarial industry. And sometimes, certainly in the past, we've had a low bid competitive environment for construction, which has led to a way of gaming construction and claims being put together by surveyors and legal experts, which has led to an adversarial culture, which is perhaps a bit different to some of the collaborative cultures that I've talked about in other parts of the world. So I think it's very much a mixed bag. I think we have got some great things happening in UK construction that we can be proud of. I think we've built some fantastic projects. I think we export our skills quite well, particularly in the professional arena. But I think in terms of a whole life, collaborative, industrialized approach, we are perhaps behind some others.
Yeah. Okay. And where specifically would you say that we're actually falling behind, maybe culturally or commercially, within sort of construction in comparison to other markets?
I think some of this is bound up, with the general economic success of the country, if you like, and how well the economy is doing, etc. But culturally and commercially in construction, I think we have a tendency, perhaps in the UK, to resist change, and both digitally and in a sustainable sense, and in industrialised construction sense. So we do have a tendency to resist change, and I think that's one issue. As I explained before, in terms of our legal system and approach, there tends to be a lack of collaboration, although there's a lot of work being done in that area, and there's more collaborative forms of contract that are available now. So I think that's one area we can improve quite a lot on. I think linked to that collaborative approach is something I mentioned earlier, by the way, which is the whole concept of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary working. I think we train our professionals to be narrow and deep, which is great in terms of their competence and skills, but not necessarily great in terms of their team working and how they work with other professionals. I think all professionals need to understand the inputs and outputs of others and how they can work better in an interdisciplinary way. And I think that would aid collaboration in the UK construction industry to a great degree. And I think that's not just across professions in terms of engineers, surveyors, architects. That's also across the whole life in terms of the front end of construction and design, the construction of the asset, and the handover of the asset, and then the subsequent maintenance. I think we all need to understand each other's inputs and outputs better in order to operate as a more collaborative industry. I think that there is probably a bit of inconsistent quality in the UK as well, and we've seen that manifest itself in terms of fire safety issues that I mentioned earlier, for example. And I think, again, personally, I think that can be improved, and we are looking to improve it through much stricter regulation and standards enforcement. I think the other thing about the UK industry that I personally experienced is, there is a bit of a burnout culture. People work very hard in construction, and there is a bit of a culture for that in construction, because it's an industry, project after project industry, which always has timescales and deadlines, and those timescales and deadlines can add a lot of pressure to the way people work and how people do their work. And I think sometimes the old time, quality, cost triangle needs to be looked at very closely at the beginning of projects, and people need to have honest conversations about what can be achieved rather than what they hope can be achieved.
Yeah. No, no, some really good points just on just these cultural nuances that exist here in the UK, and yeah, about how potentially that's kind of creating a gap. I guess in some areas, and as you mentioned earlier, in some areas we're obviously doing much better and really well in comparison to other markets.
Yeah.
So if we now kind of move, from the now and the today and where we're at today, specifically, the role of cost management and quantity surveying, how do you see that changing over the next 10 years?
Um, yeah, I hate to be a futurologist because generally they're wrong. But I'll tell you one way to look at this is that when I graduated in 1981 with a degree in quantity surveying, the first job I had, the partner had a new microcomputer on his desk.
Mm,
And he basically said to me as a new graduate, what do I do with it, Alan? So I wrote a program because in those days you could write programs for microcomputers rather than buying them off the shelf. And we used it for cash flow forecasting, and that was the beginning of the use of the microcomputer in 1981. But at the same time, I happen to know that the RICS produced a briefing for quantity surveyors in 1981 talking about how microcomputers would change the job completely. And to a degree, it's happened, of course, but not perhaps in the way that we thought in 1981. And I use that analogy because I think it's probably similar today about the futurization and digitalization of the industry. I don't think it will happen in the way that we think, but it definitely will happen. So, predictive cost intelligence, for example, is one area where I think it will change. Because going back to my thoughts on prediction earlier, I think how you predict things in the industry, particularly in terms of cost, is going to be so important. And I think AI can help that enormously. And I think that if we get the data right and the standards right, and people are willing to share data in the industry, then I think that can be improved enormously. And I think it will change the profession quite a lot. And I think AI, as I say, can help that. I think the deep integration of building information modeling and digital twins is obviously going to affect the industry, and quantity surveyors are part of that and need to be part of that, not just an add-on to it. They need to be wholly embroiled in that. And then I think going again, repeating something I said earlier, whole life. I think looking at life cycle costs versus capital costs, AI and a deeper integration into the digital transformation will help that become a reality rather than allow resources to be applied in the right directions, particularly in terms of the longevity of buildings and how they're maintained, etc., and hopefully avoid some of the problems we've had recently in the public sector in that regard. I think also the role will change in terms of soft skills, because I think that as well as increasing digitisation, which is obviously requiring numerical and logical skills, I think the ability to communicate and influence and explain the outputs will become even more important, and therefore I think quantity surveyors and cost managers should concentrate on those aspects as well. I think other things that may change are things like continuous cost assurance, because I think that people are becoming aware that the gap between, this is more on the contracting and supply chain side, if you like, but I think the gap between what people are reporting and what is actually happening and how it affects the bottom line of the business, there's been a bit of a disconnect. And one of the issues there, by the way, is the disconnect between the thinking of quantity surveying and the thinking of accountants working at the company. And the Carillion demise was actually an example of that. So I think the whole issue of how quantity surveyors explain and influence and how they connect to other professions is actually quite important for them as well. And I think that also applies to things like project controls and programming and planning, because I think quite often quantity surveyors and cost managers think that's somebody else's job. But I
Yeah.
think in order to understand cost issues, they really do need to understand programming and planning, the impact on critical path analysis, etc. It's not just a forensic tool. It's a now tool in terms of assessing progress on a construction project. So I think it's quite important that some of these what are considered peripheral professions to quantity surveyors actually understand more, and take on board. And I think, lastly, I think, as I said before, sustainability and carbon economics is going to come into cost management and quantity surveying. It's already become part of what they do, but I think it's going to be much more systemised, and helped by the digitalisation of the industry that I've already talked about.
Yeah, no, no, some really good and interesting points that will shape the role. And I think because you mentioned it, we actually had James Garner, who is obviously one of your fellow colleagues at the RICS, on a couple of weeks ago. And although I would assume he's maybe this probably happened about 10 years or so later for him, he had a similar experience when he first joined an organization, and they had just acquired, sort of a microcomputer, and he was also given the task to figure out how to use it for that firm. I think he said it was in the early 90s. So yeah, just to kind of take a step down memory lane, and this might even just be in hindsight for you, and might reveal some things that you probably have just become used to. What are the major changes that have happened over the last sort of 20, 25 years? No, that more than that, I guess, over the sort of last 30, 40 years as the role of a QS. What would you no longer do anymore that when you first started out your career was sort of the main parts of your role?
Well, this will make people laugh who are part of my generation, but essentially, I don't have a load of pieces of paper all over the living room floor, trying to. I used to call it the cut and shuffle technique of preparing bills of quantities. So, yes, there are various tasks in quantity surveying which have just completely disappeared. Measurement hasn't disappeared. I still think it's an important practice for quantity surveyors to understand how to measure things, but the issue is that the process and the digitalisation of that process has just meant that, shuffling bits of paper on your living room floor is no more. But so yeah, I think there are many things. I think, as I said right at the beginning, the complexity of the industry has changed as well. It is a much more complex industry. I think, having worked on some large projects as well, what I've seen is that, um, the need to document, the process, and provide evidence to that documentation of the process is the flip side of greater regulation and standardization. And sometimes that can be applied in a very defensive and retrospective way, and it gets in the way of building, if you like. It gets in the way of construction. But it is important in many ways, because otherwise we get the problems that have been well publicised in the industry. So I think the real challenge for the future, looking at the past to indicate the future, is that, as we've said in this conversation, that the digitalisation of the industry makes all that much more seamless and integrated than it has been to date. Because I think what I've seen in my career is the beginnings of the seeds of that, but not the ability to actually do it in a seamless, integrated digital way. A lot of people have talked about digitalization for many years in the industry now, but it's not actually become possible to do it. Now I think the industry is on the verge of transformation, because I think the technology is we've eventually reached the point where the technology is coming through to allow us to do it. Now that's frightening to some, but I see it as a real opportunity.
No, that is very, very exciting. And thanks for giving that example. So considering, as you suggested, that this role will change significantly, and there are a whole set of new skills that will become more important. For a junior QS, maybe graduating from university today, probably learning a lot of the same stuff that you learned a few years ago, maybe in a much more slightly digital way, but a lot of the content will still be the same. How much of that do you think they should not necessarily disregard, but what should they be looking at to focus on to make sure that they're still relevant in sort of 5 to 10 years from now?
Yeah, good question. And I think educationalists are looking at this all the time, obviously. But I'd sum it up in two words. Actually, I think we have to assume a kind of value leadership position in the industry. It's not just about cost; it's about value. I think that's been well versed for many years now. But it's so important to understand what that really means. And I think leadership, because I think cost and carbon economics is actually central now to the efficient delivery of construction. So I think that data literacy is obviously key, and understanding the potential of artificial intelligence, but also understanding how to put it into practice. And I think alongside that, digital modeling as well, and scenario modeling, because what you can do with numbers and good data is, as I said before, show a picture, both in terms of cost and in data and in carbon economics, that allows people to make better decisions at all stages of the project, and across the whole project life cycle. So I think those digital modeling techniques that artificial intelligence, BIM, digital twins will allow, as long as it's in an integrated way, will be what quantity surveyors coming into the industry now need to really understand, and get to grips with. I think at the same time, systems thinking is important. I think systems thinking is a whole discipline on its own, but you need to understand organisationally, that because we're dealing with various players in the industry, how they interact, and going back to what I said before, understanding their inputs and outputs so that you can really contribute and ask them for the right information in the right form at the right time. So I think systems thinking is quite important. I think a whole culture of thinking about procurement in different ways as well is important. A less adversarial culture, a culture that allows us to assess bids and assess programs and portfolios work on a more consistent and collaborative and long-standing basis, so that we're not chasing low margins all the time in the industry is important as well. And I think if you're working on the contracting side, supply chain resilience is quite an important concept as well, and understanding that you're only as strong as your supply chain, and how to embrace them and engage them and connect with them is important for quantity surveyors of the future. I'll also go back to that point that I've mentioned before about interdisciplinary working. I think quantity surveyors of the future do need to get to grips with interdisciplinary working and need to understand those inputs from all the people around them and how they can help you in terms of doing your job. I think governance and assurance is important moving forward, and I think training and mentoring as well. So I think you need to get well mentored when you enter the industry, and that is a challenge because it's always time pressured. But that is so important in terms of professional development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. Some really good insight to take away for young QSs getting into the profession, and what they can actually focus on to ensure that they have the right skill set to stay relevant. Now, we've spoken about this on a number of previous episodes, but there's been a number of sort of high profile company collapses or companies going into administration, and naturally that gives management teams, business owners sort of a lot of anxiety about managing their costs, cash flow, and cost management more generally. If you were to advise sort of a management team today, what advice would you give them on how they can sort of have more cost certainty and better manage their costs? Like where would be the first 2 or 3 places you would tell them to go look or start working on?
Well, it's always about the early decisions, isn't it? So you need to, whatever the process and procedure is for deciding which projects to bid for, which projects to accept, how to predict what your costs are going to be, how to predict all the issues that we've talked about on this call, such as time and quality as well, then it's about those early decisions and getting them right. And obviously, digitalisation and some of the things we've mentioned on this call in terms of standards application, etc., all work towards that. So I think it's key to get those early decisions right in terms of moving forward in a good way. But once you're there, then you need again the governance and assurance and sort of systems thinking to make you able to react in real time, because things do go wrong. So you need to be able to not react in a staccato way, but to be able to react in a real time way to issues on construction projects. And I think if you've got your system set up to enable that to happen, then you're in a much stronger place than someone who doesn't. And then finally, at the end of the project, I mean, if things have gone wrong, then you need the evidence and accountability to be able to sort out who's going to pay for what and how it's going to be rectified. So again, if you've had your systems in place and your record keeping in place, then you'll be in a much stronger position to be able to do that. So I think all these things come together. That's what I'm saying in terms of possible transformation in the industry, because the people who manage to connect these dots and get the digitalisation of the industry in a real place, both in terms of early decision making, subsequent control, and the forensics, will succeed to a much greater degree than has been possible to date.
Yeah. No, I think some great points that our listeners and business owners can actually take away to try and improve their cost management and generally how they run their construction business. Thank you so much for everything you shared today. Just to kind of wrap up, what would you say you're optimistic about for the future of construction?
Look, I'm always a glass half full person, I hope, but I really enjoyed my time in the industry. I think it's a great industry to work in. One of the things that's not emphasised enough about is the variety in construction, project after project, different people, different projects. It's a fantastic industry to work in. I think it's on the edge of transformation. I think there is a clear regulatory system in place now for some of the problems that we've had in the last 5 to 10 years. I think digitalisation is beginning to mature to the point where some great things will come of it in the next 5 to 10 years. And I look forward to a predictive, high quality, high value delivery ecosystem across the whole life, because that's what the construction industry should be.
Yeah, great. Well, no, thank you so much for your time today. We've really enjoyed listening to you, and I'm sure our listeners will too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.